Sundays used to arrive without effort, slipping into the house the same way light slipped through the windows in the late morning, unannounced and familiar. There was no sense of urgency attached to them, no pressure to make the most of the day, no awareness that time was doing anything other than stretching itself comfortably. Sundays felt like a pause the world agreed to take together, a quiet understanding that some days were meant to move slower than others. In many homes, including mine, Sundays naturally led everyone to the table, not because it was special, but because it was always there. The same table we used all week, worn in places no one talked about, holding the same chairs in the same positions. It didn't change for Sundays, and neither did we. That was part of what made it feel permanent, as if repetition itself was proof that nothing could ever really disappear. People gathered without watching the clock. Plates stayed on the table long after the food had cooled, not because anyone was lingering intentionally, but because no one felt the need to rush away. Conversations drifted in and out, sometimes overlapping, sometimes fading into comfortable silence. There was no agenda, no destination, just the shared understanding that this was where we were supposed to be. Back then, Sundays didn't feel meaningful. They felt normal, expected, automatic. No one talked about preserving them or appreciating them. We didn't label them as important moments. They didn't ask to be remembered. They simply happened, week after week, quietly reinforcing the idea that this rhythm was stable and unchanging. The table absorbed everything without judgment. It held laughter that didn't need explanation, stories told more than once without apology, small complaints that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. It listened to plans that would never happen, and memories that had already been told too many times. Nothing about it felt remarkable because nothing about it felt rare. No one spoke about time passing. No one mentioned that years were moving forward. We assumed there would always be another Sunday, another meal, another moment when everyone would sit down again in the same way. That assumption lived quietly beneath everything, shaping how little attention we paid to what was happening right in front of us. I grew up inside that certainty. I learned to believe that routines like this were immune to change, that repetition meant safety, that what happened often enough became permanent by default. I didn't question it, not because I was naive, but because there was nothing around me suggesting I should. It never crossed my mind that these Sundays were temporary. They didn't feel fragile. They didn't feel borrowed. They felt like a fixed part of life, something time would naturally protect simply because it had always existed. I thought the table would always be full, that the chairs would always be pulled back, that the sound of people gathering would always return the following week. Only much later did I understand how quietly time works, how it doesn't interrupt or warn or ask permission, how it moves forward even when everything feels still. Those Sundays were not waiting for us. They were passing, doing what time always does, even when we believe we are standing still. But back then, none of that was visible to me. I sat at the table without thinking about the future, without questioning the rhythm, without sensing an ending. I listened, I ate, I stayed, and I believed, without hesitation, that this was simply how life would always be. As the years passed, the table remained the center of Sundays, but the people around it slowly began to change. Not in obvious ways that demanded attention, but in subtle shifts that only became clear much later. Voices deepened or softened, schedules grew more complicated, and the simple act of sitting together started to carry unspoken layers that didn't exist before. At the time, it still felt effortless, even as life quietly added weight to the moments we shared. Sundays had their own small rituals, repeated so often they became invisible. Someone always reached for the same serving spoon. Someone else poured drinks without being asked. Plates moved around the table in a familiar pattern, guided by memory rather than thought. These details never felt important enough to notice, but they anchored the day in a way that nothing else did. Without them, Sundays wouldn't have felt like Sundays at all. Conversation followed a rhythm, just as predictable. The week was reviewed without urgency, not to solve anything, but simply to be acknowledged. Small frustrations were shared, and quickly softened by laughter or distraction. Stories overlapped, sometimes unfinished, sometimes repeated word for word. No one minded. The point was never the content of what was said, but the act of speaking and being heard. There were pauses that settled naturally, moments when no one spoke and no one felt the need to. Those silences were not empty. They carried a sense of ease, of familiarity, of knowing that presence alone was enough. Back then, silence didn't signal distance or discomfort. It was simply part of being together, as normal as the sound of cutlery touching plates. I didn't recognize how rare that kind of silence was. I accepted it without curiosity, assuming it existed everywhere and would always be available. I believed that if words ran out, time would wait patiently until more arrived. The idea that silence itself could be fragile never crossed my mind. Sundays continued like this, steady and reliable, shaping my understanding of family without ever announcing their influence. I learned what togetherness felt like without being taught. I absorbed a sense of belonging without realizing it was being formed. The table did its work quietly, holding us in place week after week. As I grew older, I began to occupy a different seat at the table, both literally and figuratively. My place shifted slightly, my attention wandered more easily, and the outside world started to compete with the familiarity of home. Even then, Sundays felt unchanged, as if they were immune to the pull of time and responsibility. There were moments when I looked around the table and felt something close to comfort, though I wouldn't have used that word at the time. It was a sense of continuity, of knowing exactly where I belonged for that hour or two. The world felt manageable when everyone was gathered there, even if I couldn't explain why. Nothing about those Sundays felt temporary. They didn't carry the weight of something that could be lost. They felt rooted, dependable, and quietly protected by habit. I assumed the table would always be there, and that we would always find our way back to it, no matter how life changed. Looking back now, I can see how those moments were already shifting, thinning slightly around the edges, even as they continued to repeat. But at the time, repetition felt like permanence, and permanence felt like a promise no one thought to question. Over time, the world outside the table began to press a little closer. Responsibilities grew quietly, without asking permission, and Sundays started to share space with thoughts about the week ahead. School, work, obligations, plans that hadn't existed before, slowly entered the room, sitting invisibly among us. We still gathered, still ate together, but the feeling of endless time began to thin, even if no one said it out loud. The meals themselves didn't change much. The same dishes appeared again and again, prepared the same way, served in the same order. Familiar smells filled the house, settling into the walls like they always had. But there was a subtle difference in how we moved through it all. People checked the time a little more often. Someone would mention needing to leave early, another would arrive late and apologize, already half pulled back into their own life. Conversation shifted in small, almost unnoticeable ways. We still talked about the past, but the future began to take up more space. Schedules were compared, plans were mentioned without detail, time frames replaced open-ended moments. The table listened as it always had, but what it heard was slowly changing, shaped by lives that were growing more separate. I noticed these changes without understanding them. They didn't alarm me, they didn't feel like losses, they felt like progress, like a natural part of growing up and moving forward. I believed that Sundays could adapt, that the table could stretch to hold whatever new shape our lives took. I trusted that the core of it would remain untouched. There were still moments of comfort, moments when everything lined up just right. Laughter would return easily, stories would overlap again. For brief stretches of time, it felt exactly like it always had. Those moments reassured me, convincing me that nothing essential was slipping away. I held on to them as proof that some things truly stayed the same. Yet, beneath that reassurance, something quieter was happening. The pauses between gatherings grew slightly longer. The meals felt shorter, even when the clock said otherwise. The sense of being suspended in time began to fade, replaced by an awareness that the day was moving forward whether we were ready or not. I began to feel pulled in different directions, though I didn't yet recognize it as tension. Part of me wanted to stay rooted at the table, to keep Sundays untouched. Another part was curious about everything waiting beyond it. I moved between those feelings without choosing either one, assuming there was room for both. The table remained steady, doing what it had always done, holding us when we came back to it. It didn't demand consistency or punish absence. It waited quietly, trusting we would return. I mistook that patience for permanence, believing that waiting meant it would always be there. Looking back, I can see how easily we confuse continuity with certainty. How repetition can convince us that nothing is changing, even as life gently rearranges itself around us. At the time though, Sundays still felt secure, and I continued to believe that the moments we shared at the table were immune to time. As I grew older, my relationship with Sundays began to change in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The table was still there, the chairs still arranged in their familiar positions, but my presence at them felt less automatic. I arrived carrying more of the outside world with me, my thoughts divided between where I was and where I still felt I needed to be. Even so, I took comfort in knowing that the table would always be waiting, unchanged and patient. I started to notice how each person around the table brought a different kind of energy with them. Some came tired, others distracted, others quietly holding on to thoughts they didn't share. The ease that once defined those gatherings began to require a little more effort, though no one acknowledged it. We smiled, we talked, we ate, all while adjusting to the growing weight of our individual lives. The conversations reflected that shift. They still touched on familiar ground, but they also carried hints of stress, responsibility, and time constraints. Work schedules, obligations, and commitments outside the house made their way into the dialogue, subtly reshaping what Sundays meant. The table absorbed these changes without protest, just as it always had. I found myself listening more than speaking, watching how people moved, how quickly plates were cleared, how often glances drifted toward the clock. These details didn't upset me, but they did leave a quiet impression, like something I wasn't ready to name. I sensed that Sundays were no longer suspended outside of time, even if I wanted them to be. There were moments when I wished I could hold the day still, stretch it just a little longer, return it to what it used to be. But I didn't know how to do that, and I didn't yet understand why I wanted to. I assumed that wanting was enough, that desire alone could protect what mattered. Despite everything, the table continued to offer a sense of grounding. Sitting there reminded me of who I was and where I came from. Even as life pulled me forward, Sundays gave me a place to return to, a reminder that some part of me remained connected to those earlier rhythms. I began to understand that change doesn't always arrive with disruption. Sometimes it enters quietly, settling into familiar spaces until it feels normal. Sundays didn't end abruptly. They evolved, slowly and gently, until the difference between before and after was hard to pinpoint. At the time, I accepted those changes without resistance. I trusted that the essence of our gatherings would survive whatever adjustments were necessary. I believed that as long as we kept returning to the table, Sundays would continue to mean what they always had. Only later would I realize how fragile that belief was, and how easily even the most familiar rituals can slip away when time is allowed to move forward unchecked. At some point, Sundays began to feel shorter, not because the hours had changed, but because my attention had. I arrived at the table already thinking about what came next, already aware of the week, waiting on the other side of the day. The ease I once carried into those gatherings was replaced by a quiet restlessness, a sense that time was something I needed to manage rather than inhabit. I started telling myself small stories to justify it, that this was just part of growing up. That responsibility naturally crowded out simplicity, that the comfort of routine didn't need my full attention anymore. I believed that Sundays were strong enough to survive neglect, that they didn't require the same care as new things did. The table noticed before I did. Chairs were pulled back more quickly. Plates were cleared with a sense of purpose instead of patience. The lingering that once defined those afternoons gave way to efficiency. Nothing felt wrong, exactly. It just felt different, like a song played slightly faster than before. I caught myself leaving early more often, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without one. I promised myself I would come back next week, more present, more attentive. I trusted that there would always be another chance to sit longer, to listen more closely, to let the day unfold the way it used to. Around the table, others carried similar shifts. Conversations became more fragmented, interrupted by thoughts that lived elsewhere. Laughter still appeared, but it faded faster. Silences felt more transitional, less settled. We were together, but not in the same way we once had been. I noticed how easily habits can thin without disappearing entirely, how something can continue to exist while slowly losing its weight. Sundays didn't vanish, they softened, becoming less central, less protected, and because they were still there, I assumed they would always be. There were moments when a familiar feeling returned, catching me off guard. A story would stretch on without interruption. A pause would settle naturally. For a brief instant, it felt like the old Sundays again. Those moments reassured me, convincing me that nothing essential had been lost. I didn't understand that what I was feeling wasn't loss yet, but warning. A quiet invitation to pay attention before something slipped beyond reach. But warnings don't announce themselves clearly. They blend in, disguised as normal change. So I continued as I was, believing I had time, believing that routines this old were immune to endings, believing that Sundays, like the table itself, were permanent fixtures in a world that otherwise never stopped moving. Only much later would I realize how easily we confuse familiarity with permanence, and how often we overlook the moments that ask for our full presence, simply because they have always been there. As life continued to move forward, Sundays became something I fit in, rather than something that shaped the week. They no longer stood apart as a pause, but blended into the larger rhythm of obligations and expectations. I still showed up, still sat at the table, but I arrived carrying more of myself elsewhere, divided between what was happening in front of me and what waited beyond it. The table remained steady, offering the same surface, the same chairs, the same familiar arrangement. It didn't change to match us. We were the ones changing around it. The contrast between its constancy and our movement made the shift feel less obvious, allowing me to believe that nothing essential had been lost yet. I began to notice how conversations shortened, without anyone deciding they should. Topics were raised, acknowledged, and then set aside more quickly than before. There was less wandering, less circling back. The table still held our voices, but it no longer held our attention in the same way. Sometimes I watched the clock without realizing I was doing it, not because I was impatient, but because I had learned to measure time differently. Hours were no longer something to be lived inside. They were something to be allocated. Sundays had become another space to manage rather than a place to rest. I told myself this was simply maturity, that growing older meant learning how to balance things, that comfort didn't need the same kind of devotion as new responsibilities did. I assumed that what truly mattered would survive with less care, because it always had before. Others around the table seemed to feel the same way. There was an unspoken agreement that Sundays could bend to accommodate our lives. We trusted that the structure would hold, even as we leaned on it less. No one suggested stopping. No one named the change. There were still moments when the old feeling surfaced, usually without warning. A laugh would linger. A story would unfold slowly. For a moment, time loosened its grip, and the table felt like the center again. Those moments were brief, but they carried enough familiarity to keep me from questioning the larger pattern. I didn't yet understand how endings often disguise themselves as adjustments, how something can fade without breaking. Sundays were not taken from us. They were slowly released, piece by piece, through inattention and assumption. I believed I would notice when something truly ended, that there would be a clear line, a final gathering, a sense of closure. I trusted my awareness more than I should have. Time rarely offers that kind of clarity, so I continued to sit at the table when I could, believing that showing up was enough. One didn't realize that presence, when divided, carries a different weight, and that one day, the opportunity to return fully would no longer be there. The last Sunday didn't arrive with any sense of finality. It felt like every other one before it, familiar and unremarkable, settling into the house without asking for attention. I came to the table carrying the same quiet distractions I had learned to accept as normal, unaware that this gathering would eventually stand apart from all the others. Nothing about the meal felt different. The food was familiar. The seats were filled in the usual way. Voices rose and fell without urgency. If anything, it felt comforting in its predictability, reassuring me that the rhythm I trusted was still intact. I had no reason to believe this Sunday was asking for more of me than the others had. Conversation moved easily, touching on small details of the week, plans that would soon be forgotten, observations that didn't need follow-up. Laughter appeared briefly, then faded. Silence followed without discomfort. Everything unfolded the way it always did, steady and reliable, offering no sign that it was quietly closing a chapter. I remember thinking about what I needed to do afterward. Tasks waiting, messages unanswered. The week ahead already forming in my mind. I was present, but not fully. My body sat at the table, while part of my attention leaned forward, already preparing to leave. At some point, Plates were cleared more quickly than I noticed. Chairs were pushed back. Someone stood up first, then another. The gathering dissolved the way it always had, gently and without ceremony. There were no lingering glances, no pauses, heavy with meaning. I left the table without marking the moment. I didn't look around to memorize faces. I didn't take note of the way the room felt. Why would I, believed, without question, that this scene would repeat itself again soon, unchanged and waiting. Days passed, and then weeks. Life filled the spaces where Sundays used to settle so easily. I didn't immediately miss anything. Absence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as busyness. It wasn't until later that I realized something had shifted, not broken, not ended dramatically, just altered in a way that could not be undone. The table was still there, but the certainty that surrounded it was gone. I began to understand that some moments only reveal their importance after they have passed. That we don't always recognize the last time while we are living inside it. That familiarity can be the very thing that keeps us from seeing what is slipping away. That Sunday didn't feel like goodbye. It felt like continuity. And that is what made it so easy to let go without noticing. The realization didn't arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, like a thought that takes time to become clear. At first, it was just a mild sense of disorientation. The feeling that something expected hadn't happened. A Sunday passed without the familiar gathering, and I told myself it was temporary. Schedules conflicted. Life was busy. There would be another chance soon. There always had been. When the next Sunday arrived without restoring what I expected, the absence became harder to ignore. The table sat unused for longer stretches, holding its silence without explanation. The house felt different on those days, quieter in a way that wasn't restful. I moved through the hours without the anchor I had grown accustomed to, unsettled by how easily the day slipped away. I found myself thinking back to past Sundays without intending to. Images surfaced unexpectedly. The arrangement of chairs, the sound of plates being set down, the way conversation filled the room without effort. These memories arrived without emotion at first, more like observations than reflections. It took time for their weight to settle. As the pattern continued, I began to recognize what I had lost. Not the table itself, not the food or the routine, but the shared presence that once defined those afternoons. The feeling of being held within a moment that didn't demand anything else. The understanding that time could pause simply because we were together. I stood by the table one Sunday, unsure why I felt drawn to it. The surface looked the same, marked by years of use, familiar and unchanged. Yet standing there alone, I could sense how much of its meaning had come from the people who once gathered around it. Without them, it was just furniture, waiting for a purpose. It no longer served in the same way. Memory began to shift from background to foreground. Moments I had overlooked before now felt vivid and precise. The way voices overlapped, the comfort of predictable conversations, the quiet assurance that this space belonged to us. I hadn't realized how deeply those details had shaped my sense of stability. With that awareness came a new kind of regret. Not sharp or overwhelming, but steady and persistent. It wasn't regret for something I had done wrong, but for something I had assumed would always remain available. I understood, too late, that attention itself is a form of care. Sundays continued to pass, each one reinforcing the absence. The table no longer gathered people without effort. It required intention now. Coordination, planning. The ease that once defined it was gone, replaced by a sense of formality that never quite captured what had been lost. I began to see how easily rituals dissolve when they are no longer protected. How repetition alone is not enough to sustain meaning. What once felt inevitable had depended on our willingness to show up fully, something I had slowly stopped doing without realizing it. The loss didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, understated, and deeply personal. It settled into me gradually, teaching me that endings don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive disguised as postponements, delays, and assumptions that tomorrow will offer what today no longer holds. By the time I fully understood what had changed, the version of Sundays I remembered existed only in memory. And memory, unlike routine, does not repeat itself. With time, the memory of those Sundays began to take on a different quality. They no longer felt like simple recollections of routine, but like places I could return to when the present felt unsteady. I found myself revisiting them in quiet moments, not to escape, but to understand what they had given me without my noticing. The table, once ordinary, became a symbol of something larger. It represented a kind of togetherness that didn't require explanation or effort, a space where presence was enough. I realized how rarely life offers that kind of simplicity, and how easily it can be overlooked when it appears in familiar forms. I started to notice how much those Sundays had shaped my expectations of connection. I looked for that same sense of ease in other places, often without success. Conversations felt rushed. Gatherings felt scheduled rather than lived. I understood then that what I missed wasn't the event, but the feeling of time slowing down around people who belonged to one another. Sometimes, I tried to recreate it. I invited people over. I set the table. I followed the motions I remembered so clearly, but the results were different. The rhythm didn't settle the way it used to. Everyone arrived carrying their own urgency, their own distractions. The ease I longed for couldn't be summoned on command. This wasn't anyone's fault. Life had moved forward, and we had moved with it. The conditions that allowed those Sundays to exist had quietly disappeared. I realized that moments like that require more than repetition. They require a shared willingness to be present, something that becomes harder as responsibilities grow. There was a time when I felt frustrated by this realization, when I wanted to blame myself for not protecting those Sundays more carefully. But frustration eventually softened into understanding. I had been living inside the moment, not observing it. I couldn't have known what it would mean later. The memory of the table began to feel less like a loss and more like a gift. It had given me a reference point, a quiet standard against which I measured connection and belonging. Even though I couldn't return to it, its influence remained with me. I noticed myself slowing down in small ways, choosing presence when I could, resisting the urge to rush through moments that felt unremarkable. Those Sundays had taught me something without words, and that lesson lingered long after the routine itself ended. As I reflected on them, I understood that what felt permanent had always been temporary, held together by time and attention. The mistake wasn't that the Sundays ended, it was believing they would never change. In remembering them now, I wasn't trying to bring them back. I was learning how to carry them forward, allowing their quiet influence to shape how I lived in the present. They had passed, but they had not disappeared. They had simply transformed, becoming part of who I was. As I grew more aware of what those Sundays had meant, I began to notice how differently time felt in their absence. Days no longer opened into one another with the same ease. Weeks moved forward without a clear pause, and rest became something scheduled rather than felt. I realized how much those gatherings had quietly organized my sense of time, giving it a shape I had taken for granted. The table still existed, but its role had changed. It was no longer a natural point of return, no longer the place where the week gently folded in on itself. Now it waited for intention, for planning, for effort. What once happened organically now required coordination, and even then, it rarely felt the same. I thought often about how easily we assume continuity, how we believe that because something has always been there, it will continue to be there without our care. Those Sundays had relied on more than habit. They depended on our willingness to protect unstructured time, something the world slowly teaches us to surrender. In remembering this, I became more attentive to small moments elsewhere in my life. I noticed how quickly conversations could slip past without depth, how easily silence was filled out of discomfort. I recognized the urge to rush, to move on, to stay productive even when nothing demanded it. Those Sundays had offered a different model. They showed me that value doesn't always come from efficiency or purpose. Sometimes it comes from staying, from allowing time to unfold without directing it. That understanding stayed with me, even as the original setting disappeared. There were moments when I felt a quiet grief for what had ended. Not an overwhelming sadness, but a steady awareness that something irreplaceable had passed. I let that feeling exist without trying to resolve it. Loss, I learned, doesn't always need to be fixed. Sometimes it simply needs to be acknowledged. Over time, grief softened into clarity. I saw those Sundays more clearly as they were, not idealized, not exaggerated. They weren't perfect, they were ordinary, and that ordinariness was exactly what made them meaningful. I understood then that memory doesn't preserve moments exactly as they happened. It distills them, holding on to what mattered most. In my memory, the table became less about food or conversation, and more about presence, about the permission to slow down together. That understanding changed how I approached my own life. I became more mindful of where and how I spent my time. I began to notice the moments that felt quietly significant, even when nothing dramatic was happening. Those Sundays at the table were gone, but their lesson remained. They taught me that time is not something we control, but something we experience. And that the moments we assume will repeat forever are often the ones that shape us most when they finally come to an end. As the years continued, I found that memory began to surface in quieter, more unexpected ways. Not as nostalgia that demanded attention, but as a subtle presence woven into ordinary moments. A late afternoon light would fall across a room in a familiar way, or the sound of dishes being set down would pause me mid-step. In those moments, I wasn't trying to remember Sundays at the table, yet they arrived anyway, gently and without effort. I started to understand that memory doesn't wait for permission. It appears when the present creates just enough space for it to enter. Those Sundays returned to me not because I was longing for them, but because something in my life slowed down enough to resemble what they once felt like. Stillness invited them back. There were evenings when I found myself sitting longer than necessary, resisting the urge to move on to the next thing. I noticed how unfamiliar that resistance felt at first. Productivity had trained me to believe that stillness was wasted time, but something deeper recognized it as essential, a feeling I traced back to those long, unstructured Sundays. I realized then that the table had taught me how to exist inside time, not just move through it. Those gatherings had given me a reference point for what presence felt like, even when I hadn't known how to name it. Without that reference, I might have accepted constant motion as normal, never questioning what was missing. As I reflected on this, I stopped judging myself for not having protected those moments more fiercely. Understanding arrived with compassion rather than regret. I saw how natural it was to assume that what feels stable will remain so, especially when it forms the foundation of our earliest experiences. Those Sundays had shaped my sense of safety in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. They had shown me that connection didn't require intensity or performance. It could exist quietly, sustained by repetition and shared time. That realization felt grounding, like rediscovering a part of myself that had always been there. I noticed how this understanding changed the way I listened to others. I became less eager to fill silence, more comfortable allowing conversations to unfold slowly. I recognized the value of simply being present, a value that had once been modeled for me without explanation. In a world that often rewards speed and efficiency, this awareness felt almost radical. Choosing to slow down, to stay a little longer, to let moments breathe, went against much of what I had learned later in life, yet it felt deeply familiar, rooted in something older and more personal. The memory of those Sundays no longer carried sadness, it carried instruction. It reminded me that not everything meaningful announces itself loudly, and that some of the most important lessons are learned through repetition rather than emphasis. By allowing those memories to inform how I lived now, I wasn't trying to recreate the past. I was honoring it, letting its quiet influence shape the way I moved forward, one unhurried moment at a time. With that understanding came a shift in how I measured my days. I no longer judged them solely by what I accomplished or how efficiently I moved from one task to another. Instead, I began to notice whether I had truly been present anywhere, even briefly. That question, once foreign to me, became a quiet guide, shaped by memories I hadn't realized were still teaching me. I thought often about how easily attention slips away when it isn't protected, how quickly moments dissolve when we treat them as background instead of substance. Those Sundays had never asked for attention explicitly, yet they had thrived on it. They existed because we showed up without distraction, something I had slowly unlearned without noticing. There were times when I tried to explain this feeling to others, but words never quite captured it. How do you describe the importance of something that felt ordinary while it was happening? How do you explain that the value was hidden inside repetition, inside the comfort of knowing exactly where you belonged for a few quiet hours? I realized then that meaning often hides inside familiarity. We overlook it because it doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't sparkle or interrupt. It simply waits to be noticed, trusting that someone will eventually understand its worth. Those Sundays had waited patiently, offering their lesson long before I was ready to receive it. This realization softened my view of time. I stopped seeing it as something that betrayed me by moving forward. Time hadn't taken those Sundays away maliciously. It had simply continued, doing what it always does. The loss came not from its movement, but from my assumption that certain moments were immune to change. I began to forgive myself for that assumption. There was no failure in not knowing. We live inside moments before we ever have the chance to reflect on them. Expecting awareness in real time is asking too much of ourselves. Understanding often arrives only after distance has been created. As this acceptance settled in, the memory of the table felt lighter. It no longer carried the weight of regret, but the warmth of recognition. I could appreciate what those Sundays had been, without wishing to return to them exactly as they were. Their purpose had already been fulfilled. I saw how those gatherings had quietly prepared me for loss itself. They had taught me how to sit with silence, how to allow absence to exist without panic. The ending of Sundays mirrored the way many things end in life, gradually and without announcement. That awareness made me more attentive to the present. I noticed when something felt quietly important, even if it seemed ordinary. I learned to pause when I sensed that familiar calm, recognizing it as something worth staying with, even briefly. Those Sundays had ended, but their influence had expanded. They continued to shape how I understood time, presence, and connection, long after the table itself stopped gathering people the way it once had. As I carried these reflections with me, I became more aware of how rarely life offers moments that ask nothing from us. Most experiences demand response, reaction, or movement. Those Sundays had been different. They asked only that we remain where we were, allowing time to pass without interference. Recognizing this made me see how precious and uncommon that kind of space truly is. I noticed how easily people, including myself, fill every pause with noise or activity. Silence has become something to manage, rather than inhabit. Yet the silence around the table had never needed managing. It existed naturally, supported by shared presence, rather than filled by distraction. That kind of silence is difficult to recreate once it's gone. There were moments when I wished I could offer others the same experience, to create spaces where time could soften again. But I learned that this cannot be forced. It requires a collective willingness to slow down, something that can't be scheduled or commanded. It emerges only when everyone involved chooses presence over urgency. This realization helped me let go of the idea that I could bring those Sundays back exactly as they were. The conditions that allowed them to exist belonged to a specific time, a specific arrangement of lives that no longer aligned. Accepting that was not a loss, but a form of respect for what had been. I began to see repetition differently. What once felt like permanence, I now understood as opportunity. Each repeated moment is a chance to notice, to be present, to recognize value before it passes. Repetition does not guarantee continuation. It only offers familiarity, and familiarity can quietly fade if we stop engaging with it fully. This understanding changed how I approached ordinary moments. I paid closer attention to the everyday gatherings that still existed in my life, however brief or imperfect. I resisted the urge to rush through them, even when they didn't resemble the past. They didn't need to. Their worth came from presence, not comparison. I learned to recognize when a moment felt settled, when it carried that same calm I remembered from Sundays long ago. When I felt it, I stayed. I didn't reach for my phone or my next obligation. I let the moment exist without trying to define it. That choice felt like a quiet tribute to what had shaped me. Over time, this awareness became less intentional and more instinctive. I began to trust that staying present, even briefly, mattered. That moments didn't need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. That ordinariness itself can hold deep value. Those Sundays had taught me this without ever saying a word. Their lesson had simply waited until I was ready to understand it. And now, carrying that understanding forward, I could honor them by living differently, even in small, imperfect ways. In this way, what once felt like an ending revealed itself as a beginning, shaping not only how I remembered the past, but how I chose to experience the present. As this awareness settled more deeply, I noticed how time itself seemed to respond to the way I met it. When I rushed, everything felt thin and fragmented. When I slowed down, even briefly, moments gained weight and texture. I realized that those Sundays had never been about having more time, but about inhabiting the time that already existed. I thought about how easily we postpone presence, telling ourselves we will pay attention later, when things calm down, when schedules ease, when life becomes simpler. Those Sundays had existed before life demanded simplicity. They existed because we allowed them to, without negotiation. Understanding this reframed how I viewed my own choices. There were days when I caught myself standing at a table again, different from the one I grew up with, yet carrying echoes of the past. The surface felt unfamiliar, the surroundings new, but the impulse to stay lingered. In those moments, I recognized the quiet invitation to pause, the same invitation I had once accepted without thinking. I understood then that places matter less than the way we occupy them. The original table had not been special on its own. Its meaning came from how we gathered around it, how we stayed, how we allowed time to loosen its grip. That realization freed me from trying to recreate the past exactly as it was. I began to trust that similar moments could exist again, not as replicas, but as variations. They would look different, involve different people, unfold under different circumstances. But the essence, the calm permission to slow down together, could still be found if I was willing to recognize it. This shift softened my relationship with loss. Instead of seeing it as something that only takes, I began to see how it also clarifies. Losing those Sundays taught me what they had been giving me all along. Without their absence, I might never have understood their value so clearly. I no longer felt the need to measure my life against what had ended. The memory of those gatherings became a guide rather than a comparison point. It reminded me to notice when something felt quietly right, even if it seemed ordinary or fleeting. There were times when I felt gratitude instead of longing. Gratitude that I had known that kind of presence at all. Gratitude that it had shaped me in ways that continued to unfold. Gratitude that the lesson had stayed with me, even when the routine had not. In this way, the Sundays of my past stopped feeling distant. They became integrated into how I moved through the present, influencing my pace, my attention, and my willingness to remain still when nothing demanded action. What once felt like a loss gradually revealed itself as a foundation. Those moments had not disappeared, they had simply changed form, living on through the awareness they left behind. As this awareness settled more deeply, I began to notice how time responded to the way I met it. When I rushed through my days, everything felt thin, fragmented, easily forgotten. But when I allowed myself to slow down, even briefly, moments gained weight and texture. I realized then that those Sundays had never been about having more time, but about inhabiting the time that already existed. I thought about how often we postpone presence, telling ourselves that we will pay attention later, when life becomes calmer, when schedules ease, when everything finally feels under control. Those Sundays had existed long before life felt simple. They existed because we allowed them to, without negotiation or justification. Understanding this changed the way I saw my own choices. There were days when I found myself standing at a different table, in a different place, surrounded by a different version of life. The surface felt unfamiliar, the voices around it new, yet the instinct to stay lingered. In those moments, I recognized the same quiet invitation I had once accepted without thinking. The invitation to pause and remain. I understood then that places themselves are rarely what we miss. What we long for is the way we once occupied them. The original table had not been special on its own. Its meaning came from how we gathered, how we stayed, how we allowed time to loosen its grip while we were together. That realization freed me from trying to recreate the past exactly as it had been. Instead of searching for replicas, I began to trust that similar moments could still exist. Not as copies, but as variations. They would look different, involve different people, unfold under different circumstances. Yet the essence, the quiet permission to slow down together, could still be found if I was willing to recognize it. This understanding softened my relationship with loss. Rather than seeing it only as something that takes, I began to see how it also clarifies. Losing those Sundays revealed what they had been giving me all along. Without their absence, I might never have understood their value so clearly. I stopped measuring my present against what had ended. The memory of those gatherings became a guide instead of a comparison. It reminded me to notice when something felt quietly right, even if it seemed ordinary or fleeting, and to stay with it a little longer. There were moments when gratitude replaced longing. Gratitude that I had known that kind of presence at all. Gratitude that it had shaped me in ways that continued to unfold. Gratitude that the lesson remained, even after the routine itself had faded. In this way, the Sundays of my past no longer felt distant. They lived inside how I moved through the present, influencing my pace, my attention, and my willingness to remain still when nothing demanded action. What once felt like an ending slowly revealed itself as a foundation. Those moments had not disappeared. They had simply changed form, continuing to exist through the awareness they left behind. Looking back now, I see that those Sundays were never meant to last forever. They were moments offered quietly, without ceremony, asking only to be lived while they existed. Their power came not from duration, but from repetition, from the way they returned again and again, until they shaped who I became without my noticing. I understand now that time does not betray us when it moves forward. It simply continues. What feels like loss is often the moment we finally recognize the value of what once felt ordinary. Those Sundays did not disappear suddenly. They fulfilled their purpose and then made room for something else to grow in their place. The table no longer gathers people the way it once did, and that is not a failure. It is a reminder that life evolves, that relationships change shape, that presence must be renewed rather than assumed. What mattered was never the table itself, but the way we showed up to it when we did. I carry that understanding with me now, quietly influencing how I live. I notice when a moment asks me to stay. I resist the urge to rush through what feels familiar. I recognize that today's ordinary experiences may become tomorrow's memories, shaping me in ways I won't understand until much later. There are still times when I miss those Sundays, when the memory surfaces with a softness that catches me off guard, but the feeling no longer pulls me backward. Instead, it reminds me to pay attention, to value presence while it is available, to honor what exists now rather than mourning what has passed. I have learned that memory is not meant to trap us in the past. It is meant to guide us forward. The lessons we gather from what we have loved and lost become part of how we move through the world, informing our choices without demanding our return. Those Sundays taught me how to sit with others without expectation, how to allow time to breathe, how to find meaning in stillness. They taught me that connection does not need intensity to be real, and that repetition can be a form of care when we meet it with attention. I no longer wish for those moments to come back exactly as they were. I wish instead to recognize their echoes when they appear in new forms, to see them in quiet gatherings, unplanned conversations, shared meals that linger a little longer than expected. In doing so, I honor what those Sundays gave me. I allow their influence to live on, not as nostalgia, but as awareness, not as longing, but as guidance. They continue to shape me, even now, long after the table stopped gathering us in the same way. And in that understanding, I find peace.